Up at the top, there's a thin line that comes off to the side. And the next thin line down is 10 times as much radiation. The next line down is another 10 times. So now we're up to 100 times the original level. And then 1,000 and 10,000. And by the time we get to the bottom of this diagram, it is 1 billion times more radiation than up at the top. Now, how much is 1 billion? We hear these numbers, billion, million, trillion, all the time. And it's tempting to say, oh, well, 1 billion is 3 more zeros than 1 million. It's only 3 more. So, that's not much more. But it's 1,000 times more. It's 1,000 million. So, a way to think of this is to compare these numbers with distances. If this top line is this much, 1/6 of an inch, then this bottom line is from here to New York. That's how much 1 billion is. Think of how many of these you need to pace off from here to New York. It's a lot of little pieces. So now the radiation up at this top level is the radiation from eating a banana. Eating a banana? Well, banana is rich in potassium. And potassium, naturally, one of the isotopes of potassium happens to be radioactive. So if you eat a banana, you get a very tiny amount of radiation. It's not very much. In order to kill you instantly, you would have to eat 1 billion bananas. I think you're going to die from something else before the radiation gets you. So the point here is not that eating a banana is dangerous. I don't want you to be afraid to eat bananas. The point here is that this level is so safe that it's just eating a banana. We can keep eating bananas. We can eat hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of bananas and not be getting any significant amount of radiation. I think there's a question here.
Well, another scale that people are familiar with, although they may not know it, is the Richter scale. And the top of the chart will be comparable to a 0.1 earthquake, which is less than your heartbeat, where the bottom of your scale would be a 10-0 earthquake, which would flatten every structure in the town.
Right, absolutely. And from the smallest earthquake that we've felt to the largest earthquake that I think most of us have felt, going from about a magnitude 3 to not quite a magnitude 7, that's like about this much on this diagram. So you have to do that about 3 times before you get to this kind of scale. So this is quite a big range going through all of these. Now, if we look down around it shows at the top of the bottom page, average CT scan. And actually, different kinds of CT scans have a good amount of variation. So the different CT scans will show up either around the bottom of the first page or the top of the second page. A CT scan is not going to kill you. It's not something you want to do every day. But, if you've got something that there's some risk that you have a brain hemorrhage, a cancer, something like that, you need to go and get a CT scan. And the risk of the CT scan is substantially less than the risk of whatever other problem you have, and it's a perfectly reasonable risk. So basically what we can figure is that the things on this top page are things that are not really too bad. The things on the bottom page, especially the lower part of the bottom page, those are the things that you really need to be worrying about. So how much radiation did we get here from Fukushima? The strongest reading that was made anywhere was in Anaheim. And this is using very sensitive equipment that can detect what energy is put out by the radioactivity, and there's a very specific signature associated with radioactive iodine and cesium. And so they could really clearly tell that what they were seeing was a signature from a nuclear reactor. So they knew they were seeing fallout from Fukushima. But the amount of radiation they detected was up here, at eating a banana. And that was the highest reading measured anywhere in the United States. And there aren't that many detectors, there was a lot of space in between. So maybe somewhere in between they weren't measuring, they was eating 2 bananas. Still, the radiation we got here was not really too bad. We were lucky. But, I'll tell you the truth, I was scared. And I didn't take any chances. I went out and I bought kelp and I bought iodine. Just in case the numbers started going up, I was going to start taking them. Didn't want to take any chances. Luckily, the numbers never went up and I never took them. Radiation in the ocean and the food chain is a very, very good question. So now let's turn to what happened in Japan, so I can get to that. In Japan, the radiation levels are much, much higher. For the workers in the plant, some of them were exposed to levels that are around the middle of the bottom page. These are really dangerous levels. These are levels where there is definite worry about these people showing immediate effects of the radiation. The workers at the plant, the people who, after the accident, had to go into the reactors to try to survey the damage and figure out what could be done.
Have they reported any radiation deaths?
No, there have not been any radiation deaths
They have
reported.
not reported any.
Yes, definitely emphasize reported there. For people who are just outside the reactor, people who live nearby, mostly they were like right at about the CT scan level, but exactly how much radiation they got depends on a lot of things. Did they evacuate immediately, or were they among the many who stayed around for a month or two? How close were they to the reactor? Were they unlucky with what direction the wind was blowing on a particular day? And so there very well could be some people who were outside the plant who saw levels that were maybe a third of the way down the bottom page. The kind of levels that certainly could cause cancer 20, 30, even 80 years from now. And that's the situation we have with Chernobyl. It's really hard with Chernobyl to know how many people it's going to ultimately kill. Because over the 100 years during which Chernobyl will be causing cancers, there will be millions of people who naturally die of other kinds of cancer all over Europe. So how do you measure these 10,000 or so deaths due to Chernobyl out of the millions that are already happening? There's no way to really measure that. So you have to make guesses based on what levels of radiation were measured at various points of time and what kind of effect you believe that has on people. And so you get that very rough estimate. If we try to estimate what the effect was in Fukushima, well, the radiation was not as much radiation, maybe about a tenth as much radiation as at Chernobyl. It didn't spread as far, so the good news is it's not going to be affecting so much people in China and Korea, and so that'll help reduce the impact. On the other hand, it means that the radiation stayed close in, and the people who were close in could be very severely affected. And the worst thing about Fukushima is that the population density around the reactor is much higher there than it is out in the boonies of the Ukraine where Chernobyl is. And so we really don't know how many people are ultimately going to be affected by Fukushima. But if I were to take a guess, I think it could very well end up being quite comparable to Chernobyl. It won't be as spread over as big an area, but within that area, with that high population density, I think it ultimately could be tens of thousands of people who get cancer and die from it who wouldn't have otherwise. Let me now, before I get to your question, let me get to, because I still haven't answered yours on the oceans. So one thing we heard of a lot in the news was they said, well, we're really lucky. The radiation seems to be blowing out to sea, and the ocean is really big. The radiation is going to get spread very far and wide, and so it's not going to have any effect. But how come it is that we're not supposed to eat too much large fish because of the mercury? The ocean's a big place, but the mercury accumulates in the big fish. It moves up the food chain. That's my worry with this radiation. And there are different radioisotopes with different aspects to them. You hear a lot about radioactive iodine, and when we consume that, it goes straight to our thyroid gland, causes thyroid cancer and other kinds of problems. Because it gets so concentrated, it's quite dangerous. The good news about radioactive iodine is that it has a radioactive half-life of about 8 days. So after a month, only a few % of it is left. After a year, it's almost all gone. And so it doesn't really accumulate very well. Another isotope we're hearing a lot about is cesium-137. And cesium-137 has a 30-year half-life, so that's bad news. However, it has a biological half-life of about a month. That's because cesium acts in our bodies just like potassium. And our body is constantly taking in potassium, and unless you have kidney disease, your kidneys flush out the potassium. You have potassium coming in, potassium coming out. Any particular atom of potassium only stays in your body about a month. And so cesium probably is not going to work its way up the food chain. It's probably going to do the same thing in the fish and not stay in the fish long enough for it to work its way up the food chain. So maybe, and I'd really like to get input from a biologist on this, and I haven't been able to do that yet. But my impression is that maybe cesium isn't as big a worry. The thing that has been a big worry with Chernobyl, and I haven't heard very much about with Fukushima, I don't know what levels were released, but what I am worried about is strontium-90. Strontium-90 has a long radioactive half-life. Again, it's about 30 years. And it has a long biological half-life. Strontium acts like calcium, and so it goes into your bones, and it stays there pretty much forever. And so it's going to be there in your bones, and that could very easily be causing leukemias and other kinds of cancers.
And it's worse with children developing.
Dave points out it's worse with children because, of course, they have developing bones. And so they're going to have that strontium-90 in their bodies for their entire life. And it may very well be 80 years before we see those people dying of those cancers. And so it's going to be even harder to get any kind of measurement of what the effect of this is. So my advice as far as the food supply is probably it's safe, but it's really a wise thing that we should be keeping an eye on what's going on and are the radiation levels, especially in the bigger fish, accumulating. It's definitely something that we need to keep an eye on.